When they bumped Darius Cole from business class to make room for a white executive, the flight crew saw just another black man accepting his place. They never noticed his quiet observations, the journalist recording their dismissive treatment, or the flight attendant's growing realization of who he really was. Their mundane act of discrimination was about to collide with the calculated plan of a tech billionaire whose ethical AI could prove what statistics had long suggested. Bias wasn't an anomaly. It was the system. As the wheels touched down, Darius sent one final message: initiate Phase 2. Outside, federal agents waited on the tarmac, ready to transform one airline flight into a watershed moment for corporate accountability. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. And if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. The early morning sunlight streamed through the massive windows of JFK's Terminal 4, casting long shadows across the polished floors as Darius Cole made his way toward Gate B-22. Unlike most high-powered executives, he traveled light, just a sleek carry-on rolling behind him and a well-worn leather messenger bag slung across his shoulder. His charcoal suit was well-tailored but deliberately understated, his only accessory a simple titanium watch that had been his first significant purchase after his company went public. Travelers rushed past him, bumping shoulders without apology, their eyes sliding over him with the casual dismissal reserved for those deemed unimportant. Darius observed it all with quiet attention, mentally recording each interaction. These were the small daily indignities that algorithms couldn't capture, the subtle biases that shaped everyday experiences but evaded quantitative analysis. His phone vibrated in his pocket. He stepped aside, positioning himself against a support column where he could watch the gate area without being obvious. "Morning, Taylor," he answered, his voice deep and measured. "Everything in place?" "Yes, sir," his assistant replied, the familiar click of her keyboard audible in the background. "The contract test is ready. Legal's on standby. But—" She hesitated. "But what?" Darius prompted. "I still think this approach is unnecessarily risky. We have conventional channels for addressing these issues. The board is concerned about potential blowback." Darius watched as a harried mother struggled with a collapsing stroller, while a gate agent pointedly ignored her, rushing instead to assist a well-dressed older white couple who had just arrived. "Conventional channels require conventional evidence," he replied, his tone firm but not unkind. "And conventional evidence is easy to dismiss as isolated incidents or misunderstandings. Did the decoy profile work? Perfectly. You're listed as D. Cole in the system and the name was flagged exactly as predicted by our algorithm. 78% probability of seat reassignment if capacity exceeds 90%. And the flight status? 93% full. Business class officially at capacity but with 2 seats that could be reassigned based on priority protocols." Darius nodded, though Taylor couldn't see him. "Good. Let the test run its course. I'll call you once we land." He ended the call and continued toward his gate, blending seamlessly into the crowd despite his 6'2" frame. Few would guess that the modest man with the quiet smile was worth north of $8 billion, or that his decision to take this particular flight would send shockwaves through an entire industry by tomorrow morning. At the gate podium, Flight Supervisor Marla Jennings scrutinized the passenger manifest with pinched lips and narrowed eyes. 27 years in the airline industry had left her with a rigid sense of hierarchy and deeply ingrained biases she refused to acknowledge even to herself. "D. Cole," she murmured, tapping the name on her tablet screen. "Business class, 4B. Her colleague Rick Thompson glanced over her shoulder, his thinning hair slicked back with too much product. "Problem?" Marla's lips tightened further. "Just unusual for a standby to get bumped to business. Full flight today." She scrolled through additional passenger data. "Hope he doesn't cause trouble?" "Why would he cause trouble?" Rick asked, though his tone suggested he already understood her meaning. "Just a feeling," Marla replied vaguely. "Keep an eye out during boarding, will you? I need to make sure everything's perfect. We've got a Kincaid on the manifest." Rick's eyebrows shot up. "Senior or junior?" "Junior. But that's close enough to the board for me. Let's make sure he's satisfied." Across the terminal, Edward Kincaid stormed toward the gate, Italian leather shoes clicking aggressively against the polished floor. His salt and pepper hair was expertly styled, and his custom Tom Ford suit probably cost more than most passengers' monthly salary. At 46, he carried himself with the entitled confidence of someone who had never heard the word "no" stick. "No, I don't care what the policy states," he barked into his phone, loud enough for nearby passengers to glance up with irritation. "My father sits on the board, for God's sake. Make it happen." He paused, listening. "Yes, clearing space in business class. I need preferential treatment, it's not complicated." He ended the call with a dismissive jab at his screen, slipping the phone into his jacket pocket as he approached the gate area. He scanned the crowd with thinly veiled disdain, mentally calculating his position in the social hierarchy of the coming flight. Near the coffee stand, Linda Park repeated safety protocols under her breath while adjusting her freshly pressed uniform. At 28, she was newer to the airline than most of her colleagues, and her eagerness to perform well was evident in her meticulous appearance and the emergency procedure flashcards peeking from her pocket. Temperature check at 72 degrees. Oxygen masks deploy automatically at cabin pressure of 14,000 feet. Follow the illuminated strips to nearest exit, which may be behind you, she whispered, fidgeting with her name tag. "First day?" asked an older flight attendant passing by with a knowing smile. "Third month," Linda corrected with a nervous laugh. "Still feels like the first day every time." What she didn't say was why, how every minor mistake felt catastrophic, how she needed this job more desperately than anyone knew, how she was hiding from a past that threatened to catch up with her at any moment. Instead, she squared her shoulders and headed toward the gate, determined to prove herself worthy of the second chance she'd been given. Just breathe, she reminded herself, one flight at a time. Boarding began 30 minutes later. Priority passengers were called first, those with disabilities, families with young children, and business class ticket holders. Darius was among them, his boarding pass stating his seat assignment clearly. 4B, business class, window seat. He nodded politely to the crew as he entered the aircraft, making his way to his assigned seat with quiet efficiency. He placed his messenger bag in the overhead compartment, taking only a slim journal and pen before settling into the comfortable leather seat. The space next to him remained empty. "Water, please," he requested simply when a flight attendant passed. "Thank you," he added when she returned, his manner genuine but not overly familiar. 2 rows behind in business class, Janet Rowe observed the interaction with interest. As a freelance journalist with 15 years of experience and a knack for human interest stories, she had developed an instinct for the unusual. There was something about the man in 4B, a dignity in his posture, a watchfulness in his eyes that suggested more than a typical business traveler. She also noticed how other passengers glanced at him with subtle suspicion, a fleeting evaluation that spoke volumes about ingrained prejudices. A white businessman in business class was unremarkable. A black man in the same space prompted immediate, if unconscious, assessment. Janet opened her notebook app, typing quickly, "Class versus race dynamics in transit spaces. Passenger reactions to diversity in premium cabins." She wasn't sure there was a story yet, but 20 years of journalism had taught her to trust her instincts. Boarding continued smoothly until Edward Kincaid arrived. 15 minutes after his assigned group had been called, he strode down the jetway like he owned it, phone still glued to his ear. "Has to be business class," he was saying loudly as he reached the aircraft door. "No, I won't." He paused, scanning the cabin. "I'll call you back." Marla Jennings approached. Immediately, her professional mask transforming into genuine deference. "Mr. Kincaid, welcome aboard. Is there something I can help you with today?" Edward handed her his boarding pass, economy class, row 14, with barely concealed contempt. "This won't do. I need to be in business class." "Of course, sir." Marla nodded, glancing at her tablet. "Let me see what I can do." Her eyes darted around the cabin, landing on Darius. A solution presented itself immediately in her mind. She walked over to where he sat reading, her professional smile thinning perceptibly. "Sir," she began, her tone clipped, "I'm afraid there's been a booking error with your seat assignment. We need to relocate you to economy class. Darius looked up from his book, his expression neutral. A booking error? I booked this seat 3 months ago and checked in yesterday. Yes. Well, Marla continued, lowering her voice but not her condescension. Sometimes these things happen in our system. We're overbooked in business today, and we need to make adjustments. We don't want any problems, sir. The implied threat hung in the air between them. Darius held her gaze for a long moment, his face revealing nothing of his thoughts. Finally, he closed his book and nodded once. I see. Without further protest, he gathered his belongings and followed Marla to a middle seat in row 27, squeezed, between a mother with a fussy infant and a man whose size required him to use a seatbelt extender. The discomfort was immediate and obvious. Sorry for the inconvenience, Marla said insincerely, already turning away. Enjoy your flight. Janet Rowe watched the entire exchange, her fingers flying across her phone screen. Passenger mysteriously demoted from business class. No explanation. Given. Profile. Black male, professionally dressed, calm demeanor. Flight supervisor's body language suggests predetermined decision rather than system error. From her position near the galley, Linda Park also observed the scene. A flicker of discomfort crossing her face before she busied herself with preparation tasks. As the final passengers boarded and settled in, Darius sent a text message to his assistant. Postpone the Geneva release. Something bigger is unfolding. I need this flight to play out. He tucked his phone away, settling into the cramped middle seat with the patience of a man who had expected exactly this outcome, and prepared for it. The airplane's engines hummed steadily as it reached cruising altitude. Darius closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to remember. His mind drifted back 25 years, to a cramped room in a rundown group home in South Chicago. 16-year-old Darius sat on his thin mattress, a flashlight clenched between his teeth as he pored over a worn physics textbook. Outside, police sirens wailed, their sound so common in the neighborhood that none of the other boys even looked up from their cards or comics. Earlier that day, 2 officers had pushed him against a wall, searching him roughly for a stolen watch he knew nothing about. You fit the description, they'd said, though the only description that mattered was the color of his skin. The marks from their grip still showed on his wrists as he turned the pages of his book. Lights out means lights out, Cole, the night supervisor barked, slamming the door without waiting for a response. But Darius didn't turn off his flashlight. He kept reading, kept learning, kept planning his way out. They can take your seat, his grandmother had told him before she passed, but they can't take what's in your head. Remember that, boy. What's in your head is yours forever. 25 years later, with 3 patents and a multinational tech company to his name, those words still guided him. Patience wasn't just a virtue. It was a strategy, one that had served him well in boardrooms and venture capital meetings where he was often the only black face present. The memory faded as the flight attendant announced they were at cruising altitude. Darius opened his eyes, the lesson from his past informing his present tactics. He shifted uncomfortably in the tight space, his knees pressed against the seat in front of him. 3 rows ahead in business class, Edward Kincaid was already on, his second scotch, his voice carrying deliberately over the cabin noise. My father basically built this airline's international strategy, he boasted to his seatmate, a visibly uncomfortable woman who kept glancing at her book. That's why I never worry about seating arrangements. There's always room for the right people. Janet Rowe, seated across the aisle, kept her body angled away as if absorbed in her tablet, but her recorder app was capturing every word. As a journalist who specialized in corporate culture exposés, she recognized the goldmine of arrogance unfolding across from her. Frankly, Edward continued, lowering his voice just enough to seem conspiratorial, but not enough to prevent eavesdropping, I'm glad they're starting to be more selective about who gets seated up front. Certain types just don't understand the etiquette. It degrades the experience for everyone else. His companion made a non-committal sound, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge someone of Edward's obvious social status. This tacit acceptance only emboldened him further. Take that fellow they moved to economy, clearly out of his depth. Probably used points or some diversity promotion to get the seat in the first place. Janet added a note to her growing document. Passenger, assuming discrimination justified based on stereotypes, using dog whistle phrases to imply belonging, non-belonging. In the galley, Marla gathered her crew for a brief huddle under the pretense of reviewing meal service. Good call on the seating adjustment, she told them, her voice hushed but unmistakably. Smug. Kincaid Sr. would have had my job if Junior didn't get his upgrade. The family has connections all the way to the CEO. Rick Thompson chuckled, adjusting his tie. Did you see how quickly that guy moved? No argument, just straight to the back where he belongs. Smart man. Linda Parks shifted uncomfortably but said nothing, her eyes darting to the cabin as if afraid. Passengers might overhear. What's wrong, Park? Too PC for airline reality? Marla challenged, noticing her discomfort. No, Linda struggled to find words that wouldn't jeopardize her position. I think we should stick to procedures. The passenger had a confirmed business class reservation. Procedures are for normal days, Marla dismissed with a wave of her hand. Today we keep the VIPs happy. That's protocol 1 in this industry if you want to advance. Her eyes narrowed slightly. You do want to advance, don't you, Park? The, implied threat wasn't lost on Linda. With her brother's legal fees piling up and her mother's medical bills barely covered by insurance, she couldn't afford to lose this job. She nodded reluctantly. Good. Marla checked her watch. Let's get the drink service started. During the beverage service, Linda paused at Darius's row. I'm sorry about your seat, sir, she said quietly while handing him a tomato juice. We don't usually, it's not standard procedure to... It's all right, Darius interrupted gently, accepting the drink with a soft smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Thank you. Their eyes met briefly, and Linda felt a strange sense that he was seeing more than just a flight attendant, as if he could somehow read the conflict written in her hesitation. She moved on quickly, but felt his gaze follow her as she continued down the aisle, as if he was cataloging her for reasons she couldn't understand. In his cramped middle seat, Darius pulled out the flight manifest he'd requested from Taylor before boarding. His company's AI analytics had flagged this airline for pattern discrepancies in seating allocation and customer service response times, a sterile technical term for what was looking more and more like systematic discrimination. The numbers showed it, and now he was experiencing it firsthand. The infant next to him began to cry, its mother looking exhausted and apologetic. Darius smiled reassuringly at her. It's okay, he said, offering the baby his watch to examine. We were all new to flying once. The mother's relief was palpable. Thank you for understanding. The flight attendant already gave me such a look when we boarded. Did she? Darius asked casually, making a mental note. His phone buzzed with an encrypted message from his security team. Facial recognition confirms Edward Kincaid on your flight, son of Kincaid Holdings CEO. They're the ones who tried to undercut our bid last quarter. Darius raised an eyebrow. This was an unexpected connection. The tech company trying to steal his patents was represented by the very man who had stolen his seat. The universe had a strange sense of irony. Up in business class, Edward excused himself to make a call from the small open area near the lavatories. It's me, he said in a hushed tone, checking to ensure no one was within earshot. The patent transfer documents are ready for signing tomorrow. Once Cole's signature is on them, we own the air, literally. Their surveillance system will redirect all data through our servers. He listened for a moment, then laughed. Don't worry about Cole. He's an idealist who thinks tech should serve humanity instead of shareholders. Men like that don't last in this industry. What Edward didn't know was that Darius Cole had not only lasted, but thrived precisely because of those ideals, and because he was always 3 steps ahead of predators like Meridian Global. As Edward returned to his seat, Linda moved through the cabin collecting trash. Her mind wandered to her brother Marcus, serving 8 years for a convenience store robbery he swore he didn't commit. The evidence against him had been based on a privately developed surveillance system that flagged him as 96% likely to be the perpetrator based on movement patterns and facial recognition metrics. No human review, no context consideration, just code dictating a man's fate. What Linda couldn't know, was that Darius Cole had spent the last 3 years developing an ethical AI framework specifically designed to prevent such miscarriages of justice. The very technology Edward's firm was trying to steal and corrupt was created to protect people like her brother. Midway through the flight, Darius stood to stretch his legs. He approached a flight attendant who wasn't Linda. "Excuse me," he said, politely. "I'm having trouble finding my seat again after using the restroom. Could you help me?" The attendant barely glanced at him. "Sir, just go back to where you were sitting before." Darius persisted, his tone remaining respectful. "I've gotten turned around with the cabin lights dimmed. If you could just check my boarding pass?" "Look," she snapped, "we're in the middle of service. Your seat is back there somewhere." She gestured vaguely toward economy class before turning immediately to a white passenger who had approached with a similar question. "Of course, ma'am. Let me check your seat number for you right away." Janet Rowe, who had been returning from the lavatory, witnessed the exchange and added to her growing notes. Stark contrast in crew responses based on passenger appearance. Same question, different treatment. Immediate assistance for white female passenger. Dismissal for black male passenger. As Darius made his way back to his seat, Edward deliberately stepped into the aisle, causing Darius to stop short to avoid collision. "Sorry about that," Edward said, his apology transparently insincere. "No problem," Darius replied evenly. Then, maintaining direct eye contact, he added, "People reveal who they are when they think you're beneath them," Edward smirked, too absorbed in his perceived superiority to recognize the observation for what it was, an assessment, not a philosophical musing. "Deep thoughts from economy class," he chuckled to himself as he continued toward the lavatory. Back in his seat, Darius received another message from his legal team. "Background check complete on Edward Kincaid. He's senior counsel at Meridian Global, the firm actively trying to undercut our ethical AI framework globally. They've been lobbying against our regulation proposals for months." Darius's expression remained neutral, but his mind was racing. This wasn't just about a seat anymore, or even about discrimination in the airline industry. This was about two competing visions for the future. One where technology protected the powerful and reinforced existing biases, and one where it safeguarded the vulnerable and created more equitable systems. He typed a quick response. "Keep monitoring. Don't alert the Geneva team." This just became a much bigger test than we anticipated. As the flight continued over the Atlantic, Darius noticed Linda, watching him with a mix of curiosity and concern. She knew something wasn't right, but she hadn't pieced it together yet. He wondered how long it would take her, or anyone else, to realize who exactly had been banished to the back of the plane. The irony wasn't lost on him. In boardrooms and at tech conferences, he was Mr. Cole, or Sir. His name opened doors and commanded respect. But remove the context, place him in a public setting where his achievements weren't immediately visible, and suddenly, he was just another black man who could be moved, ignored, or suspected without cause. It was precisely why he had developed his testing protocols. Some truths only revealed themselves when people thought no one important was watching, and those were exactly the truths he was determined to expose. Janet caught his eye from across the cabin and gave him a subtle nod, as if acknowledging something unspoken between them. Darius nodded back, wondering if she had already begun to piece together the story unfolding around her. If so, she might become an unexpected ally in what was quickly evolving from a simple test into something far more significant. The flight continued, the passengers largely unaware that the real journey, one that would reshape an industry and challenge deep-seated biases, had already begun at 30,000 feet above the Atlantic. As the flight continued over the Atlantic, Linda Park retreated to the rear galley, her hands trembling slightly as she arranged coffee cups on the service cart. The exchange she'd witnessed between Marla and Darius kept replaying in her mind. It wasn't the first time she'd seen preferential treatment aboard these flights, but something about this particular incident gnawed at her conscience. Pulling out her personal phone, strictly against company policy during service, she opened the camera app and positioned it on the counter, angling it toward the cabin while pretending to check her makeup. The screen captured Marla leaning close to Edward Kincaid, their expressions conspiratorial as they spoke. "Our premium passengers deserve special attention," Marla was saying, loud enough for Linda's phone to pick up. "I always ensure certain passengers are relocated when necessary. He looks like trouble anyway. Best to keep an eye on those types." Linda felt sick but kept recording. 6 months ago, she might have ignored it, might have convinced herself it was just airline policy or passenger management. But after what happened to Marcus, she could no longer pretend the world worked fairly. Systems were biased. People were biased. And those biases destroyed lives. Across the aisle, Janet Rowe had noticed Linda's subtle recording. Their eyes met briefly, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Janet gave an almost imperceptible nod before returning to her own documentation. Meanwhile, Darius had made himself useful in economy class. An elderly white woman struggled to retrieve her bag from the overhead compartment while Marla walked past, deliberately ignoring her quiet requests for assistance. "Let me help you with that," Darius offered, rising from his cramped middle seat. "Oh, thank you, young man," the woman replied with genuine gratitude. "My arthritis makes reaching so difficult." As Darius carefully brought down her bag, Janet snapped several photos with her phone, making sure to capture Marla's retreating figure in the background. She added them to a growing thread she'd started on a private server, captioning it, "While crew ignored elderly passengers' requests for assistance, relocated passengers stepped in to help. Business class bias." The post was anonymous for now, but Janet had already decided this story warranted more than just a brief mention in her weekly column. The layers of privilege, discrimination, and corporate culture unfolding before her demanded a proper investigative piece. 2 hours into the flight, Edward Kincaid made his way down the aisle, stopping deliberately when he reached Darius's row. His confidence was that of a predator who believed his prey was unaware. "Excuse me," he said with practiced smoothness. "I couldn't help noticing you earlier. You seem intelligent. The way you handled that situation up front, very gracious." Darius looked up, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. "Thank you. I represent a technology investment firm," Edward continued, leaning against the seat in front. "We're always looking for smart people. Perhaps you'd be interested in a partnership of sorts? Something entry-level to start, of course." "I'm always open to opportunities," Darius replied, a hint of amusement in his eyes that Edward completely misinterpreted as eagerness. Encouraged, Edward lowered his voice. "We're working on some exciting acquisitions. There's this small tech firm with revolutionary AI patents. Brilliant stuff, but the current leadership lacks vision. Too many ethics concerns slowing down progress." He tapped his fingers on the seat. "We're planning to absorb them by next quarter." "And what happens to their technology?" Darius asked innocently. Edward smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. "We optimize it. Remove the unnecessary safeguards. Data is power, and frankly, all these privacy concerns and bias protections just limit potential profits." He handed Darius a business card. "Stop by our offices if you're interested. We could use someone who knows how to adapt to changing circumstances." As Edward walked away, Darius examined the card. Meridian Global, the very company attempting to undermine his life's work. The very people who created the flawed surveillance system that had imprisoned Linda's brother and countless others like him. The irony was almost poetic. Several rows ahead, Janet had finished interviewing a fellow black passenger, recording their conversation discreetly on her phone. "This isn't my first rodeo," the man told her quietly. "Last month, same airline, same story. I had reserved premium economy, got bumped to regular without explanation. White couple behind me in line, upgraded to premium. You stop being surprised after a while." Janet nodded, adding another piece to her growing exposé. "Have you ever filed a complaint?" The man laughed without humor. "What's the point? They say it's a system error or operational necessity. Nothing changes. In the forward galley, Marla cornered Linda while reviewing service items. "You're being too soft with them," she hissed. "Especially that one we moved back. I saw you apologizing earlier." "I was just providing standard service," Linda defended weakly. "There's standard and then there's excessive," Marla retorted. "Remember, we have protocols for a reason. Stick to them, or I'll have to report this breach to management." Linda nodded, averting her eyes, but her resolution was hardening with every passing minute. As she moved through the cabin helping a crying child find his dropped toy, she realized she could no longer be complicit in a system that judged people based on appearance rather than character. 3 hours into the flight, Darius retreated to the rear of the aircraft, ostensibly to use the lavatory. Once inside, he made a call using an encrypted satellite connection built into his watch. "Taylor, initiate Observation Protocol 12, he instructed quietly. "Route all incoming data through Secure Server Beta, not the main office." He paused. "And tell legal to prepare for a major disclosure. This goes deeper than we thought." "What exactly are we dealing with, sir?" Taylor's voice came through clearly despite the airplane's background noise. "Meridian Global has a representative on this flight. He's personally involved in the discrimination incident and has explicitly confirmed their intent to weaponize our technology against vulnerable populations." "That's convenient timing," Taylor observed. Darius smiled grimly. "Not convenience. Strategy." The conversation revealed what few knew. Darius had deliberately booked this flight using a profile designed to trigger the airline's biased algorithms. He had ensured Edward would be on the same route. He had baited the airline to show its true colors. What he hadn't anticipated was how perfectly the trap would work, how cleanly the evidence would present itself, how thoroughly the airline staff would demonstrate the very behaviors his AI had, predicted based on historical data patterns. As Darius returned to his seat, the memory of his first major ethical decision as CEO flooded back. 3 years earlier, his team had developed an advanced facial recognition system that major police departments were eager to implement. The contracts would have been worth billions, but testing revealed alarming bias rates against darker-skinned individuals, precisely the problem that had sent Linda's brother to prison. Instead of fixing the symptoms, Darius had scrapped the entire project and redirected his company toward creating systems that could identify and eliminate bias. It had cost him significant market share initially, but his principled stance eventually became Coltech's greatest selling point in a world increasingly concerned about algorithmic justice. Meanwhile, Linda had discovered something unexpected. While retrieving a tablet left unlocked by a distracted crew member, she noticed the full passenger manifest on screen. Her eyes widened as she read the name associated with seat 27B, the middle seat in economy to which Marla had relocated the passenger, Darius Cole, she whispered in shock. "As in, Coltech founder Darius Cole?" The tablet confirmed it. The man they had bumped from business class was one of the wealthiest tech entrepreneurs in the country, a billionaire whose ethical AI frameworks were revolutionizing everything from healthcare to criminal justice. And she knew exactly why his name mattered. 3 months ago, she had written to his company about her brother's case. Their legal team had responded, requesting additional information for their algorithmic injustice project. She'd provided Marcus's case details, hoping against hope that something might come of it. Now the very man who might hold the key to her brother's freedom was being treated like a second-class citizen on her flight. And she had been complicit. With trembling determination, Linda made her way down the aisle, stopping beside Darius's seat. "Sir," she said quietly, "I need to speak with you privately. It's important." Darius registered the knowledge in her eyes and nodded. "Lead the way." As Linda guided him toward the rear galley, she leaned closer. "I know who you are," she whispered urgently. "I know you're Darius Cole, and I think you're in danger. And not just from the crew." The rear galley offered little privacy, but with the cabin lights dimmed for the transatlantic crossing, it was secluded enough for their hushed conversation. Linda's hands fidgeted with her uniform cuffs as she faced Darius. "My brother is in prison because of a faulty facial recognition system," she confessed without preamble. I wrote to your company 3 months ago. Case file, JR7745. Understanding dawned in Darius's eyes. Marcus Park, he said quietly. Sentenced to 8 years. For a convenience store robbery he didn't commit. The system matched him with 96% confidence despite being nearly 2 miles away at the time, according to cell tower data that wasn't entered into evidence. Linda's eyes widened. You remember his case? I review every submission to the Algorithmic Injustice Project personally, Darius replied. Your brother's case is one of our priorities. The surveillance system that identified him was developed by Meridian Global, Linda finished. I know. What I don't understand is, are you testing the airline? Is that why you're here? Traveling as just D. Cole? Darius studied her for a moment before responding. Yes. We've been analyzing customer service data across major airlines for patterns of discrimination. This carrier had the highest probability of biased treatment based on our models. I needed to experience it firsthand. But why? You could have sent anyone. Because data without context is dangerous, he explained. I needed to feel what millions experience daily. The small indignities, the assumptions, the quiet bias that statistics can't fully capture. He paused. What I didn't expect was to find Edward Kincaid on the same flight. Linda's face showed confusion. Darius reached into his pocket and withdrew his phone, opening a secure file that he handed to her. This is a confidential brief compiled by our legal team, he said as she began to read. Meridian Global, Edward's employer, is responsible for the surveillance system that wrongfully identified your brother. They've been trying to acquire our ethical AI patents for months, presumably to dismantle the very safeguards that would have prevented cases like Marcus's. Linda's hands trembled as she scrolled through the document, tears welling in her eyes as she saw her brother's case specifically cited as Evidence Item 47 in a building legal case against Meridian's technology. They ruined his life, she whispered. He was applying to medical school, now he's… Her voice broke. No one would listen. We're listening, Darius assured her. And with your help, we might be able to do more than just free your brother. We could change the system that put him there. Their conversation was interrupted by Janet, who approached with purposeful strides. Sorry to intrude, she said, but I thought you both should see this. She held up her phone, displaying a private social media thread where her initial posts about the flight were gaining significant traction. Business class bias is trending in 3 cities already, she explained. People are sharing similar experiences with this airline. It's going viral. Linda stared at the screen, her professional mask slipping further. If Marla sees this, let her, Janet replied firmly. I'm a journalist, and this story needs telling. The question is whether you're willing to help me tell it properly. She turned to Darius, and whether you're ready to go public with whatever test you're conducting here. Darius raised an eyebrow. You knew? I suspected something when you were so calm about being moved, Janet admitted. Most people either make a scene or slink, away defeated. You were observing. Then I recognized you from a tech conference I covered last year. She extended her hand. Janet Rowe, freelance investigative journalist, currently working on a series about corporate accountability. As they shook hands, an unspoken alliance formed among the 3, each with different motivations, but a shared goal of exposing the truth. Janet outlined her plan. She and Linda would gather evidence of discriminatory practices throughout the remainder of the flight, documenting instances of biased treatment toward not just Darius, but any passengers of color. Meanwhile, Darius would continue his own observations, particularly of Edward Kincaid. I have an idea, Linda said, newfound determination straightening her posture. I can get access to the crew's communication logs. They're constantly messaging each other about problem passengers through the onboard system. If there's a pattern of flagging certain passengers based on appearance, that would be significant evidence, Janet confirmed. As they finalized their approach, a white male flight attendant named Steve approached them, his expression tight with disapproval. Janet, right? He said, ignoring both Linda and Darius. Flight supervisor sent me to remind you that photographing crew members without consent violates our privacy policy. We'd appreciate if you'd stop stirring things up. Janet met his gaze steadily. And I'd appreciate if you'd tell that to your legal team. They'll need the warning by tomorrow morning. Color drained from Steve's face. What's that supposed to mean? It means documentation isn't the same as disruption, she replied calmly, but feel free to add intimidation attempts to my notes. After Steve retreated, Darius returned to his seat while Linda and Janet continued their evidence gathering. The dynamics of the flight had shifted, power no longer flowing in the expected directions. In business class, Edward was growing increasingly agitated. His phone displayed Janet's trending hashtag, along with emerging commentary about the flight. He punched in a number speaking in hushed but urgent tones. We need to bury this now, he demanded. Some journalist is turning this flight into a PR nightmare. If it connects back to us or the coal acquisition. He listened briefly. I don't care what it costs. Find out who she is and get our people on it. What Edward didn't realize was that Darius had already deployed countermeasures. As part of Observation Protocol 12, his security team was monitoring all communications from the flight, including Edward's increasingly panicked calls. Meanwhile, Janet was gathering testimonies from multiple passengers, each account adding another piece to the mosaic of systemic discrimination. They always randomly select me for additional screening, a South Asian doctor told her quietly. I was told my upgrade request couldn't be processed due to technical issues, but the white businessman behind me got his processed immediately, added a black woman in a corporate suit. The call button is just for decoration if you're in the C. Back rows, an elderly Latino man said with resigned acceptance. Unless you're raising a fuss, they pretend not to see. Linda, moving through the cabin with professional efficiency, was conducting her own subtle investigation. She noted how Marla and other senior crew members spoke to passengers differently, based on apparent wealth and race. Warm smiles and, of course, sir, for some. Curt nods and, that's not possible for others. She discreetly used her phone to capture these interactions, adding them to a shared cloud folder Janet had created. When a passenger complained about cold food, Linda witnessed Marla telling a white passenger, "I'll get you a fresh meal right away," while minutes later telling a Middle Eastern passenger with the same complaint, "That's how it's supposed to be served." Each incident alone might seem minor, explainable. Together, they formed an undeniable pattern. 4 hours into the flight, Darius activated the final stage of his plan. Using the secure satellite connection in his watch, he contacted his legal team once more. Initiate Observation Protocol 12 data collation, he instructed. Cross-reference with historical customer satisfaction metrics sorted by passenger demographics. Prepare for full disclosure upon landing. Understood, came the response. The team is assembled at the arrival gate as requested. FAA representatives have been briefed that this is a potential Title VI situation. Darius ended the call just as the captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing they would begin their descent in approximately 1 hour. The timing was perfect. In a moment of quiet calculation, Darius reviewed what his test had revealed so far. Not just individual bias, but systematic discrimination baked into company culture. Not just poor customer service, but deliberate mistreatment, based on perceived status and race. Not just corporate negligence, but active complicity from management levels. And then there was Edward Kincaid, the unexpected variable who had transformed a simple ethics test into something far more significant. His presence connected the dots between biased airline practices and the larger technology ecosystem that reinforced discrimination through supposedly neutral algorithms. It was all coming together more perfectly than Darius could have planned, as might. Linda continued her rounds. The captain requested her presence in the cockpit. Her heart raced as she made her way forward, wondering if they had somehow discovered her documentation efforts. "You wanted to see me, Captain?" she asked, maintaining a professional demeanor despite her anxiety. Captain William Reynolds, a 30-year veteran with the airline, looked up from his instruments. "Park, right? Marla tells me you've been unusually attentive to that passenger we relocated from business class." Says you've been apologizing to him. Is that true? Linda chose her words carefully. I believe in providing consistent service to all passengers, Captain. Consistent, yes. Preferential, no, he replied sternly. Marla has been with this airline longer than you've been alive. She knows how things work. I suggest you follow her lead if you want your probationary period to end successfully. The threat was clear. Linda nodded and returned to the cabin, her resolve only strengthening. 6 months ago, such a warning would have terrified her into compliance. Now, it merely confirmed the pervasiveness of the problem. Back in his seat, Darius noticed Edward making another call, his expression increasingly desperate. Though he couldn't hear the conversation, the body language told him everything he needed to know. Edward was scrambling, trying to contain a situation rapidly spinning beyond his control. Janet approached Darius, sliding into the temporarily vacant aisle seat beside him. Your tech assistant is impressive, she said quietly. She just sent me a compilation of every discrimination complaint filed against this airline in the past 5 years. Patterns unmistakable, statistically significant, bias against passengers of color, particularly in upgrade and downgrade decisions. How did you? Darius began. I reached out through your company website, mentioned I was on your flight. She connected the dots. Janet smiled. Smart woman. The smartest, Darius agreed. Taylor has been with me since the beginning. Their conversation was interrupted when the captain's voice came over the intercom once more, this time with a different announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been advised of some congestion at our destination. We'll be circling for approximately 30 minutes before beginning our final approach. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. What the passengers didn't know was that the congestion was partly of Darius's creation. His team had coordinated with airport authorities to ensure the flight would land at precisely the right time, when journalists, company representatives, and federal transportation officials would all be in position. Taking advantage of the delay, Linda brought Darius a fresh beverage, using the interaction as cover to whisper, "The captain warned me to stop giving you preferential treatment. They're watching us now." Darius nodded almost imperceptibly. Perfect. Let them watch. It's all part of the record. As the plane finally began its descent, Linda returned to the main cabin, where Marla was instructing the crew on landing procedures. Her eyes narrowed when she saw Linda. Remember, we're all representatives of this airline, Marla said pointedly. Any action that undermines our policies or procedures reflects poorly on all of us. Linda met her gaze without flinching. I understand completely, she replied, the double meaning clear only to her. The aircraft banked gently, beginning its approach to the runway. Passengers gathered their belongings, unaware that for some of them, particularly the crew, this landing would be unlike any other in their careers. In those final minutes of flight, Darius sent one last message to his team. Initiate Phase 2 upon touchdown. Full disclosure, no redactions. As the wheels touched down on the tarmac with a gentle bump, the true journey was just beginning. Outside the windows, barely visible in the gathering twilight, a formation of vehicles waited near the gate. Dark SUVs with government plates, news vans with satellite uplinks, and sleek corporate cars bearing the Coltech logo. Darius Cole was about to remind the world that privilege and power weren't always visible, and that justice sometimes arrived in unexpected ways, on an ordinary flight that was about to become extraordinary. The aircraft taxied toward the gate with mechanical precision, its passengers largely unaware of the storm about to break around them. In seat 27B, Darius Cole watched the gathering twilight outside the window, his calm exterior masking the calculated anticipation within. The plane's wheels had barely touched down, but the real impact was moments away. Darius's phone vibrated with an encrypted message. All systems go. Media positioned. Legal standing by. FAA representatives in place. He sent a final encrypted message to his legal team. Initiate Phase 2 upon touchdown. Full disclosure. No redactions. The message bounced between satellites and secure servers, before reaching Taylor, who stood at the gate alongside Coltech's entire executive leadership team. She confirmed receipt with a single word: executing. In business class, Edward grew more frantic with each passing minute. His calls to Meridian Global's crisis management team had grown increasingly desperate as the plane prepared for landing. Now, with his phone showing dozens of missed messages, he sensed the walls closing in. "What do you mean, it's too late?" he hissed into his phone. "We have protocols for this sort of thing." The voice on the other end was grim. "Our systems have been locked out of the airline's network. Someone scrambled all outbound signals. From key personnel on the flight, including yours. Every call you've made has been rerouted through an unknown server." Edward's blood ran cold. "How is that possible?" "That's what we're trying to determine, sir." The tech analyst paused. "But we've just received intelligence you need to hear immediately. Our facial recognition scan of the flight manifest matched a passenger identity we weren't expecting." "Who?" Edward demanded. "Darius Cole, sir. Coltech CEO. He's on your flight." Edward froze, his hand gripping the armrest as realization dawned. He twisted in his seat, scanning the economy section until his eyes found Darius, who met his gaze with calm acknowledgement. "Oh my God," Edward whispered. "It's a setup." Several rows behind, Janet showed Linda her phone screen, where the Farney business class bias had erupted across multiple platforms. What had begun as anonymous posts documenting a single flight had connected with thousands of similar experiences, creating a digital wave of testimonials that was now impossible to ignore. "We're trending worldwide," Janet said, her journalistic instincts confirming the significance of what was unfolding. "Over 20,000 comments in the last hour alone. People are demanding the airline respond." Linda stared at the screen in amazement. "This is really happening," she whispered, half to herself. The magnitude of the moment settled over her. How a single flight, a single decision to stand up against injustice, might actually change something. Marla appeared beside them, her forced smile barely concealing her growing anxiety. "Everything all right back here?" she asked, her eyes darting between Linda and Janet's phone. "Just checking the latest news," Janet replied smoothly. "Seems like your airline is making headlines today." A flicker of alarm crossed Marla's face. She leaned closer to Linda, lowering her voice to a threatening whisper. "Whatever happens when we land, remember, it was all standard protocol. Nothing personal, just policy. We were following procedures." The self-preservation in Marla's tone was unmistakable. She was already preparing her defense, already distancing herself from whatever consequences might await. Linda merely nodded, allowing Marla to interpret her silence however she wished. As the aircraft approached the gate, a memory surfaced in Darius's mind, a boardroom in Geneva 6 months earlier, where he had first conceptualized this very moment. "We can file complaints until we're blue in the face," he had told his executive team. "We can donate to advocacy groups and fund studies. But until we force a public reckoning, nothing will fundamentally change." His chief legal officer had looked skeptical. "And your solution is to get discriminated against on purpose?" "Solution is to create incontrovertible evidence," Darius had corrected. "Not for revenge, for restructuring the system from the ground up. When they demonstrate their bias against a random black passenger, not knowing it's me, we'll have what we need now." As the plane prepared to dock at the gate, that strategy was reaching its culmination. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination. Local time is 6:45 p.m. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until the aircraft has come to a complete stop and the fasten seatbelt sign has been turned off." What he didn't announce, what he couldn't have known, was that this routine landing was about to become anything but routine. The moment the jetway connected with the aircraft, the cabin door opened to reveal not the usual ground crew, but a group of official-looking individuals in suits, flanked by airport security personnel. "What's going on?" the captain demanded as he emerged from the cockpit. A stern-faced woman with a federal ID badge stepped forward. "FAA Oversight Investigation. This aircraft and all crew members are to remain on board until further notice." Behind her stood representatives from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, Coltech's corporate counsel, and Darius's private security detail. "This is highly irregular. the captain protested. "My crew has another flight in 3 hours." "Not anymore, they don't," the FAA representative replied. "We have reason to believe federal transportation anti-discrimination regulations have been violated on this flight. All crew members will be temporarily suspended pending investigation." Marla pushed forward, indignation overriding her earlier caution. "This is ridiculous. We followed all company protocols." "That," said a voice from behind her, "is precisely the problem." Darius Cole stood in the aisle, no longer just another passenger, but fully embodying his role as one of the most influential tech entrepreneurs in the country. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable, a shift in posture, a certainty in his gaze that commanded attention. "Mr. Cole," the captain began uncertainly, "there seems to be some confusion." "There's no confusion, Captain," Darius interrupted smoothly. "What happened on this flight was documented extensively. Ms. Jennings removed me from my assigned business class seat to accommodate Mr. Kincaid, citing a booking error that didn't exist. When I requested assistance during the flight, I was dismissed while white passengers received immediate help. These weren't isolated incidents, but part of a pattern that our data analysis flagged months ago." He gestured toward Linda and Janet, who had joined him in the aisle. "Fortunately, we had witnesses willing to document the truth." Edward attempted to exit through a separate door, hoping to use his VIP status to access a private gate, only to find his path blocked by a federal agent. "Edward Kincaid?" the agent asked, though it clearly wasn't a question. "We need you to come with us. You're under investigation for potential antitrust violations related to Meridian Global's attempted patent infringements." Edward's face drained of color. "This is absurd. Do you know who my father is?" "Yes, sir, we do," the agent replied impassively. "He's being questioned as we speak." As passengers began to exit the plane, many watched the unfolding scene with a mixture of confusion and fascination. Janet was among the first to step onto the jetway, immediately surrounded by reporters from CNN, BBC, and other major networks who had been tipped off about a significant civil rights development at the airport. Janet Rowe, a CNN correspondent, called out, "Can you confirm reports that you documented systematic discrimination aboard this flight?" Janet smiled into the cameras, her years of media experience evident in her composed response. "What I witnessed today wasn't just about one passenger or one incident. It was about a culture that normalizes bias and excuses discrimination as standard procedure. The evidence speaks for itself." Her blog post, hastily published during the final approach, had already surpassed 1 million views, turning what might have been dismissed as an isolated complaint into a viral phenomenon impossible for the airline to ignore. Linda emerged next, escorted respectfully by a woman in a tailored suit who introduced herself as Coltech's chief operating officer. "Ms. Park," she said, handing Linda a sealed envelope. "Mr. Cole asked me to give you this personally." Linda opened it with trembling fingers to find an official job offer, Director of Ethics and Accountability at Coltech, with a starting salary that made her breath catch. "But why?" she asked, stunned. "Because moral courage is rare," the COO replied simply, "and Mr. Cole believes in rewarding it." Back on the plane, the captain attempted to deny any wrongdoing, addressing the federal investigators with practiced authority. Mr. Cole was treated according to standard airline protocols for seating adjustments. There was no discrimination involved. Darius raised an eyebrow, then produced a small device from his pocket. "Perhaps this will refresh your memory, Captain." He pressed a button, and audio began playing through the device. A crystal-clear compilation of the flight's most damning moments, including Marla's comments about certain types, and the captain's own instructions to Linda about following Marla's discriminatory lead. The recordings had been captured and processed in real time by Darius's team, using advanced audio enhancement technology to extract conversations even from across the cabin. "This is illegal," Marla protested. "You can't record us without consent. Federal transportation regulations permit recordings for documentary purposes during suspected civil rights violations," Darius countered smoothly. "But your objection is noted." Marla's composure finally cracked. "This is Edward's fault," she cried, pointing across the cabin. "He's the one who demanded special treatment. I was just trying to keep a VIP satisfied." Edward's face contorted with rage. How dare you try to pin this on me? You said moving him was standard procedure, that you do it all the time. Not helping your case, Edward, Darius observed mildly. Linda, who had returned to witness the exchange, stepped forward. You've been doing this for years, she said to Marla, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Targeting passengers based on assumptions, creating a hostile environment for anyone who questioned it. You told me my job depended on following your example. Marla's eyes narrowed. You little traitor. You're the one who stirred the pot. Recording. Conversations undermining authority. You'll never work in this industry again. Actually, Linda replied with newfound confidence, I've just accepted a position elsewhere. One where ethics isn't considered a liability. As the confrontation continued, passengers filed past with a range of reactions. Most moved quickly, eager to distance themselves from the drama. But one black father paused beside Darius, emotion evident in his eyes. My son is 10, he said quietly. Last month he asked me why people always look surprised when we board in first class. I didn't know how to explain bias to a child who still believes the world is fair. He extended his hand to Darius. Thank you. Darius clasped the man's hand firmly. It's not fixed yet, he cautioned, but it's exposed. That's the first step. Outside in the terminal, the airline's CEO was desperately trying to reach Darius by phone, hoping to contain the situation before it spiraled further out of control. When Darius finally took his call, the CEO's voice was strained with forced cordiality. Mr. Cole, surely we can handle this matter internally. These incidents, while regrettable, don't reflect our company's values. On the contrary, Darius replied, they reflect your company's actual values perfectly. The difference between stated principles and operational reality is precisely what we're addressing today. What exactly do you want? The CEO demanded. Abandoning pretense. I don't want anything, Darius answered truthfully. This isn't a negotiation for personal gain. Your culture was exposed. Now the world decides what happens next. As federal investigators continued interviewing crew members, Darius stepped into the bustling terminal, where a hastily arranged press area had been established. Cameras flashed. As he approached the microphone, the world's attention suddenly focused on what had begun as a simple flight. What we witnessed today wasn't an anomaly, he began, his voice measured but resonant. It was the visible manifestation of invisible systems, assumptions, biases, and procedures that separate us into categories of worth based on appearance rather than character. He paused, surveying the gathered crowd of journalists and curious onlookers. This is just the beginning, he continued, his words carried live to millions of viewers worldwide. Watch what happens tomorrow. Because in exposing one company's bias, we've created a blueprint for addressing systemic discrimination across industries. The technology exists to identify these patterns. The question is whether we have the courage to confront them. As he stepped away from the microphones, declining further questions, Darius knew the real work was just beginning. The evidence had been gathered, the exposure achieved. Now came the harder part, transforming momentary outrage into lasting change. Dawn broke over the city skyline, painting the glass towers in hues of gold and amber. In a corner office 52 stories above the streets, Darius Cole stood at the window, watching the world awaken while his phone buzzed incessantly with notifications. It had been 12 hours since the flight landed, and the fallout was spreading, faster than even he had anticipated. The airline's stock had plummeted 17% in pre-market trading. Business class bias had generated over 12 million engagements across platforms. 3 major corporate clients had already suspended their contracts with the airline, citing alignment of values concerns. But numbers and metrics told only part of the story. The true impact lay in the conversations now happening in boardrooms, classrooms, and living rooms across the country. Conversations about privilege, accountability, and the subtle discrimination that shaped daily experiences for millions. Darius turned from the window as Taylor entered, tablet in hand. They're ready for you, sir, he nodded, straightening his tie. How many arrived? All of them, Taylor replied with a hint of satisfaction. even the ones who initially declined. The elevator carried them to the building's conference level, where Coltech's largest meeting room had been arranged to accommodate the day's unusual gathering. As the doors opened, Darius was greeted by the sight of uniformed agents from the Federal Aviation Administration, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and Department of Transportation, along with representatives from consumer protection organizations and civil rights groups. "Mr. Cole," greeted Regina Barnes, the FAA's lead investigator, rising to shake his hand. "Your team has been remarkably thorough. I've never seen such comprehensive documentation of in-flight discrimination." "The credit belongs primarily to Ms. Rowe and Ms. Park," Darius replied, gesturing toward Janet and Linda, who sat at the table reviewing materials. "They showed extraordinary courage." Janet looked up with a professional nod, while Linda's expression revealed a mix of determination and lingering disbelief at finding herself at the center of such significant events. The meeting began with a detailed presentation of the evidence gathered during the flight. Recordings, photographs, passenger testimonials, and data analysis revealing patterns that extended far beyond a single incident. "Based on our preliminary investigation," announced Agent Harris from the EEOC, "we're issuing formal letters of suspension to the entire flight crew pending further review. This includes Captain William Reynolds, Flight Supervisor Marla Jennings, and 7 additional crew members." Marla and the captain were the first to receive their notices as they entered the building under escort. Their expressions shifted from defensive indignation to shock as they encountered not just federal investigators, but a room filled with media representatives, airline competitors, and civil rights attorneys. "This is a witch hunt," Marla protested, her voice brittle with panic. "We followed company training." "That's precisely what concerns us, Ms. Jennings," replied Regina calmly. "If discriminatory behavior reflects your training, then we're dealing with a systemic issue rather than individual misconduct." The captain attempted a different approach, his tone reasonable but condescending. "Mr. Cole was treated with complete professionalism throughout the flight. If there was any misunderstanding about seating arrangements, perhaps this will clarify matters," Darius interrupted, nodding to Taylor. The room's screens lit up with a split-screen compilation. On one side, security footage showing the captain's interactions with white passengers throughout the flight. On the other, his markedly different treatment of passengers of color, including Darius. The contrast was undeniable, the pattern obvious enough that several people in the room shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "These aren't isolated incidents," Darius explained. "Our AI analysis identified a 78% probability of discriminatory treatment on this airline based on historical complaint data and seat reassignment patterns. Yesterday's flight simply provided real-world confirmation of what the numbers already told us." While the federal investigation proceeded in the main conference room, Edward Kincaid was escorted to a smaller meeting area where investigators from the Department of Justice Antitrust Division awaited. "Mr. Kincaid," began the lead investigator without preamble, "we have recordings of your conversations aboard yesterday's flight, in which you explicitly discussed plans to acquire and dismantle ethical AI protections developed by Coltech. Given Meridian Global's market position, this raises serious antitrust concerns." Edward attempted his usual bluster. "Those were hypothetical business discussions, nothing concrete, certainly nothing illegal." "Perhaps," the investigator acknowledged. "But when combined with these—" He slid forward a stack of internal emails recovered from Meridian's servers through a warranted search. "They establish a pattern of anti-competitive practices targeting specifically the ethical safeguards in AI systems." Edward's face drained of color as he recognized documents he had assumed were protected by attorney-client privilege. "How did you get these?" he demanded. "The better question," replied the investigator, "is why your company deliberately targeted technology designed to prevent algorithmic bias. Technology that, if implemented properly, might have prevented cases like Marcus Park's wrongful imprisonment." For the first time, genuine confusion crossed Edward's face. "Who?" "The brother of a flight attendant on your plane yesterday, one of thousands of people wrongfully identified by your company's surveillance systems, lives ruined by algorithms. Your firm promised were infallible." As Edward struggled to process the connection, the door opened to admit Linda, accompanied by a distinguished attorney from the Innocence Project who had been working with Coltech on algorithmic justice cases. "Mr. Kincaid," Linda said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I'd like you to meet my brother's legal representative. They have some questions about Meridian Global's pattern recognition software and its 96% failure rate with darker-skinned individuals." Edward stared between them, the full implications of his company's technologies finally becoming personal in a way boardroom discussions about acceptable error rates never had. Down the hall, Janet Rowe was conducting back-to-back interviews. With major networks, her journalistic reputation soaring as her exclusive coverage of the flight that changed an industry went viral. "What made you start documenting the incidents?" asked a CNN correspondent. "Instinct at first," Janet admitted. "But as the pattern became clearer, I realized this was about more than one passenger or one flight. It was about a culture that normalizes discrimination by wrapping it in corporate policy." "And your blog? Did you anticipate this level of response?" Janet shook her head. "I hoped people would care, but the volume of similar experiences shared in response has been overwhelming. Thousands of passengers coming forward with nearly identical stories across multiple airlines." "What happens next?" the correspondent pressed. "Reform happens next," Janet replied confidently. "Because sunlight is the best disinfectant and this story has nowhere to hide anymore." As the interviews continued, passengers from the flight were exiting the building, many stopping to speak with waiting reporters. Those who had witnessed the discrimination firsthand shared their observations, while others expressed shock at learning what had transpired just rows away from them. "I had no idea," admitted an elderly white woman. The same passenger, Darius, had helped with her bag. "I was treated so kindly I assumed everyone was. It breaks my heart to think different rules applied just based on appearance." By midday, the airline's CEO arrived, flanked by a phalanx of attorneys and PR specialists. His face was grave as he approached the conference room, having clearly received instructions to offer whatever concessions might contain the expanding crisis. "Mr. Cole," he began, forcing humility into his tone, "I want to personally apologize for your experience. This doesn't reflect our company's values and we're prepared to—" "Do you know why I chose your airline for this test?" Darius interrupted, his voice calm but unyielding. "Because 6 months ago your board offered me a seat. During my due diligence, I uncovered internal reports showing systematic discrimination in upgrade and downgrade decisions, reports your executive team buried rather than addressed." The CEO blanched. "I wasn't aware of—" "You were copied on the email suppressing those findings," Darius corrected. "Your values aren't the issue here. Your actions are." The airline's response came swiftly, driven more by market pressures than moral awakening. By late afternoon, they had issued a public statement announcing the firing of multiple senior executives, the beginning of a comprehensive cultural assessment, and a partnership with external civil rights organizations to redesign training. Protocols activists and advocacy groups immediately pushed back, demanding deeper systemic reforms beyond superficial PR tactics. Social media campaigns called for independent oversight, transparent reporting of demographic data in upgrade decisions, and concrete consequences for discriminatory behavior. In a quiet moment between meetings, Linda approached Darius with a question that had been troubling her since the flight. All of this, the test, the evidence gathering, the coordination with federal agencies, you planned it meticulously. But there's one thing I don't understand. Why put yourself through the humiliation? You could have sent anyone to document the discrimination. Darius considered her question, taking a moment to organize his thoughts. "When I was 16, he finally replied, I built a simple algorithm to predict whether I'd be stopped by security guards while shopping at different stores. It was crude, based on time of day, neighborhood demographics, what I was wearing, but it was shockingly accurate." He paused, the memory still vivid after all these years. "That algorithm was my first lesson in how bias becomes systemic, how it transforms from individual prejudice into institutional practice. But the numbers alone didn't move people to action. The experience did." Linda nodded slowly, understanding dawning. You needed to feel it yourself. And I needed others to witness it, Darius confirmed. Data without narrative rarely changes hearts. And hearts, not just policies, need to change for real progress. As evening approached, Darius gathered his team for a final assessment of the day's developments. The airline stock had slightly recovered following their public statement, but the industry-wide conversation was just beginning. 3 competing carriers had already announced reviews of their own seating policies, clearly hoping to avoid becoming the next target. We've created ripples, Darius acknowledged, but lasting change requires sustained pressure. Tomorrow, we release the comprehensive report, not just on this airline but on bias metrics across the entire industry. Janet, who had joined the meeting as a media partner, nodded her agreement. I'm already receiving messages from employees at other airlines, ready to share their experiences. This could be the beginning of a transportation civil rights movement. Linda, still processing her sudden career change from flight attendant to ethics director, added her perspective. The crew's reactions today were telling. They're more afraid of being labeled biased than of actually changing their behavior. True reform will require deeper transformation. As the meeting concluded, Darius remained at the conference table, reviewing the day's events with the measured assessment of a chess player, evaluating a complex position. The exposure phase had succeeded beyond expectations. Now came the harder work of translating outrage into reform, headlines into policy changes, and momentary attention into sustained accountability. His phone buzzed with a message from Taylor. Press conference scheduled for 9 a.m. tomorrow. Title, Bias at 30,000 feet, Systems We Trust and the People They Harm. Darius approved the title with a nod. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but the groundwork had been laid. Not just for addressing this particular injustice, but for creating a blueprint that could be applied across industries where invisible bias shaped visible outcomes. As he finally left the building that evening, Darius paused in the quiet lobby, his gaze falling on a framed image on the wall, his boarding pass from the fateful flight, mounted alongside the company's ethics statement. It served as a reminder that principles without practice were merely words, and that true change required courage to confront uncomfortable truths. With renewed determination, Darius stepped into the night, already planning the next phase of a journey that had begun in a middle seat in economy class, but would ultimately transform much more than just an airline seating policy. 3 weeks after the flight that sparked a national conversation, Darius Cole stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Manhattan office, watching an electrical storm roll across the skyline. Lightning illuminated the gathering clouds in brief, brilliant flashes, a fitting metaphor for the upheaval transforming the corporate landscape below. On the television mounted to his wall, a financial news anchor was discussing the latest developments. The airline industry continues to grapple with fallout from what industry insiders now call the Cole incident. Markets opened sharply lower this morning as Coltech CEO Darius Cole prepared to launch a global press release exposing not just the airline incident, but what his team describes as a pattern of racial and class bias across multiple corporations tied to Edward Kincaid's network. Darius checked his watch. In exactly 17 minutes, the press release would go live, simultaneously delivered to major news outlets, regulatory agencies, and corporate boards across 4 continents. The document represented months of meticulous data gathering compressed into 3 weeks of round-the-clock analysis by his best team members. "Are we set?" he asked, without turning from the window. Taylor stood nearby, tablet in hand. "All systems ready. Linda's final additions have been incorporated. Janet's exclusive is scheduled to drop 5 minutes after our release. And the legal team? Standing by for the inevitable responses." Taylor allowed herself a small smile. "They expect cease and desist letters within the hour." Darius nodded, finally turning from the storm to face the storm of his own making. "Then let's change the world before lunch." At exactly 10 a.m. Eastern Time, the Coltech press release hit the digital sphere with the force of a tactical strike. Titled, Patterns of Privilege, How Data Reveals Systemic Bias in American Business, the 78-page document laid bare the algorithmic evidence of discrimination across airlines, banks, insurance companies, and hiring platforms, all connected through Meridian Global's technology infrastructure. The release wasn't just about the airline incident. It was a comprehensive exposé revealing how Edward Kincaid's company had deliberately built bias into supposedly neutral technologies, creating invisible barriers that preserved privilege while maintaining plausible deniability. Within minutes, the document was trending across platforms. Within hours, congressional representatives were calling for hearings. By noon, the collective market capitalization of the implicated companies had dropped by nearly $40 billion. As predicted, legal threats poured in, but they found themselves hamstrung by the meticulous sourcing of every claim. Coltech's legal team had spent weeks verifying each data point, ensuring the document was not just damning, but legally unassailable. Across town in a prison visiting room, Linda Park sat across from her brother Marcus, separated by plexiglass but connected by a shared sense of cautious hope. She slid a folder through the narrow opening. "It's happening, Marcus," she said, her voice steady with newfound confidence. "Cole's legal team submitted your case for expedited review yesterday. The judge has agreed to examine the evidence of algorithmic bias." Marcus's hands trembled slightly as he opened the folder. Inside was a formal letter from the State Attorney General's office acknowledging receipt of new exculpatory evidence. Specifically, documentation showing that the facial recognition system that had identified him had a 96% failure rate with men of his complexion when viewed from the angle captured in the surveillance footage. "Is this real?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. "After 3 years just like that?" "Not just like that," Linda corrected gently. "This took thousands of hours of analysis by Coltech's engineers. They've proven that the algorithm that identified you was fundamentally flawed, and that Meridian Global knew about the flaw but concealed it to protect their contracts." Marcus studied his sister, noting the changes in her demeanor. The straightened posture, the direct gaze, the absence of the nervous gestures that had characterized her prison visits since his conviction. "You're different," he observed. Linda smiled. "I found my voice on that flight, and now I'm using it to help others find theirs." As Director of Ethics and Accountability at Coltech, Linda had spent the past 3 weeks reviewing cases similar to her brother's, instances where flawed algorithms had altered lives through false identifications, denied loans, rejected job applications, or withheld medical treatments. Each case reinforced what the flight had taught her, that systems designed by humans inevitably reflected human biases, unless deliberately engineered to counteract them. Marcus pressed his palm against the glass. "I'm proud of you, sis." Linda matched his gesture, their hands separated by a barrier that suddenly seemed more surmountable than it had in years. "We're going to get you out of here. And then we're going to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Across the city in her newly established independent newsroom, Janet Rowe was directing a team of investigative journalists, all funded by a grant from Coltech's Foundation for Algorithmic Justice. Her exclusive follow-up to the airline story had transformed her from a freelancer struggling for assignments into the leading voice on technological discrimination in mainstream media. "The Kincaid statement just arrived," her assistant announced, handing her a press release embossed with Meridian Global's logo. Janet scanned it quickly, her experienced eye recognizing the formulaic corporate damage control. Regrettable misunderstandings, commitment to diversity, internal review of practices, and the inevitable "these isolated incidents don't reflect our values." She set it aside with a knowing smile. "Prepare the side-by-side comparison, their statement versus the internal emails we obtained. I want our readers to see the contradiction in their own words." Her phone buzzed with a text from Darius. "Hearing from sources that Edward's family is trying to distance themselves. Board meeting in progress. Likely outcome. Sacrificial lamb." Janet added this development to her rapidly expanding story. The Kincaid empire, built over 3 generations of privilege and connection, was discovering that even wealth couldn't fully insulate them from accountability in an age of algorithmic transparency. Meanwhile, in a private hospital room across town, Edward Kincaid was recovering from what his publicist had described as exhaustion, but what hospital records classified as an anxiety-induced cardiac event. The past 3 weeks had dismantled not just his professional standing, but his entire worldview, a reality where consequences had always been for other people. A soft knock at the door interrupted his brooding. To his shock, Darius Cole entered, alone and unannounced. "How did you get in here?" Edward demanded, reaching for the call button. "I own 17% of this hospital's parent company," Darius replied calmly. "But that's not why I'm here." Edward's finger hovered over the button. "Then why are you here? To gloat? To watch the mighty fall?" "I'm here to offer you something no one else will right now." Darius took a seat beside the bed. "A chance to be part of the solution." Edward barked a harsh laugh. "After you've systematically destroyed my career, my reputation, my family's legacy." "Your actions did that," Darius corrected. "I simply exposed them. But the question remains, what will you do now? Continue fighting a battle you've already lost, or help rebuild something better?" For the first time, genuine confusion replaced Edward's arrogance. "What are you talking about? Meridian's technology harmed thousands of people like Marcus Park, but it could be redesigned to protect them instead." Darius leaned forward. "You understand the system's architecture better than anyone. You could help us fix it." Edward stared in disbelief. "Was this always your plan? Set me up, tear me down, then recruit me?" Darius shook his head. "This was never about you specifically. It was about exposing systemic bias. Your presence on that flight was an unexpected variable, but it connected dots we hadn't anticipated. Now I'm offering you a choice." "Why would you trust me?" Edward asked, genuine curiosity breaking through his defensive shell. "I don't," Darius admitted. "Not yet. But I believe in redemption. The question is, do you?" He left the question hanging in the air between them as he stood to leave. At the door, he paused. "Consider it, Edward. Sometimes the most powerful voices for change are those who have seen both sides of the equation." As Darius left the hospital, his phone buzzed with an update from Taylor. The airline had fired 3 more senior executives, begun a rebranding initiative centered on inclusive hospitality, and issued a public apology that marketing experts were already calling unprecedented in its directness. More significantly, the airline had appointed an independent ethics board with actual oversight authority, a model that 2 other major carriers had already announced plans to adopt. The ripple effects were spreading faster than even Darius had anticipated. Back at Coltech headquarters, final preparations were underway for Darius's TED Talk, scheduled to be broadcast globally the following morning. Titled, "Bias at 30,000 Feet, Systems We Trust and the People They Harm," the presentation would serve as both capstone to the airline incident and catalyst for broader reforms. "Run through it one more time," Taylor suggested as they reviewed the presentation slides. Darius nodded, stepping onto the practice stage and facing the empty auditorium. Tomorrow, millions would watch as he connected the dots between a single flight incident and the larger patterns of algorithmic discrimination embedded in modern society. "What happened 3 weeks ago wasn't about a seat on an airplane," he began, his voice filling the empty space. "It was about who we value, who we see, and who remains invisible in systems designed to appear neutral but calibrated to preserve existing power structures." As he continued, the words flowed with the conviction of someone who had not just studied injustice, but experienced it firsthand, who understood that data without context was just numbers, and that true change required both quantitative evidence and qualitative understanding. The rehearsal concluded just as Linda arrived, bringing news that sent a surge of collective energy through the team. The judge had granted an expedited hearing for Marcus's case, citing compelling new evidence of algorithmic misconduct. "It's working," she said, emotion tightening her voice. "Not just for Marcus, but for dozens of others identified through the same flawed system. The prosecutor's office is reviewing all of them." Darius squeezed her shoulder in quiet support. "This is just the beginning, Linda. The real work happens when the headlines fade, when we have to rebuild these systems from the ground up." As the team dispersed to finalize preparations for the next day's events, Darius found himself drawn once again to the windows, watching the city below. Somewhere in that vast expanse of glass and steel, countless lives were being shaped by invisible algorithms, determining who got loans, who got jobs, who got second chances. Tomorrow's speech wouldn't fix everything, but it would make the invisible visible. It would give language to experiences many had felt but couldn't name. And in doing so, it would create space for systemic change beyond symbolic gestures and temporary outrage. The storm had passed, leaving the city bathed in the clear light of an autumn afternoon. In that moment of stillness, Darius allowed himself to feel not just the weight of the work ahead, but the significance of the shift already underway, a recalibration of power that began with a simple question: who gets to sit where and why? Later that evening, Darius walked alone through an empty terminal at the airport, having arranged special access to film part of his presentation. The space, usually teeming with travelers, was eerily quiet, the rows of seats bearing silent, witness to thousands of daily interactions where bias shaped experiences in ways most never noticed. He stopped beside a departure board, remembering the moment 3 weeks ago when he'd first entered this same airport as just another passenger, albeit one testing a theory about how he would be treated. He couldn't have known then how perfectly the experiment would work, or how far-reaching its consequences would become. As he stood there, a cleaning crew member approached, hesitating when she recognized him. "Mr. Cole?" she asked tentatively. "I just wanted to say thank you. My son applied for a job with the airline last year. 3 times he was told he wasn't the right fit, despite his qualifications. Last week they called him for an interview, said they're reevaluating their hiring practices." Darius nodded, recognizing her story as one of countless ripples spreading outward from the initial impact. "I hope he gets the job," he said simply. "He already did," she replied with quiet pride. "Starts training next month." These were the moments that mattered most. The individual lives changing because systems were being forced to change. No press release or stock price fluctuation could measure the true value of that transformation. As the filming concluded and Darius prepared to leave, he noticed a boarding pass framed on the wall, part of the airline's historical display. Something about it caught his attention, drawing him closer. It was his, from the fateful flight 3 weeks ago. Below it, a small plaque read, "A reminder that our journey toward inclusivity requires constant vigilance and honest self-examination." Smiled faintly, appreciating the gesture while recognizing it for what it was, a beginning, not an ending. The real test would come in the months and years ahead, when public attention inevitably shifted to new controversies and the hard work of systemic change continued away from the spotlight. For now, though, he allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction as he turned and walked away, leaving the terminal behind but carrying its lesson forward. That sometimes, the most powerful position wasn't the one you were given, but the one you created through the courage to stand your ground. 6 months later, the grand ballroom of the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum glowed with soft ambient light as leaders from across the transportation industry gathered for the inaugural Summit on Inclusive Mobility. What had begun as a single airline's crisis response had evolved into an industry-wide initiative for systemic reform. Darius Cole surveyed the room from a quiet corner, noting the diversity of the attendees, not just in appearance, but in perspective and position. Airline executives mingled with civil rights attorneys, software engineers engaged with disability advocates, government regulators conversed with passenger experience designers. "Quite the gathering," Janet Rowe observed, joining him with 2 glasses of sparkling water. "Hard to believe this all started with one flight." Darius accepted the glass with a nod of thanks. The flight was just the catalyst. These issues have been simmering for decades. "True, but catalysts matter," Janet replied. "My series has documented over 3,000 testimonials from passengers who experienced similar discrimination. Before your flight, they were isolated voices. Now they're a movement." In the 6 months since the incident, Janet's independent media platform, FlightCheck, had evolved from a single viral story into a respected watchdog organization monitoring corporate behavior across industries. With funding from the Coltech Foundation but complete editorial independence, her team had become the go-to source for algorithmic accountability journalism. Across the room, Linda Park was engaged in animated conversation with the newly appointed chief ethics officer of the airline that had once employed her as a flight attendant. At 39, the former NASA systems engineer was the first black woman to hold an executive position in the company's history, one of many changes implemented under the consent decree negotiated after federal investigators found pervasive patterns of discriminatory practices. Linda caught Darius's eye and excused herself, making her way through the crowd to join him and Janet. "Marcus just called," she announced, her face aglow with joy. "The university reinstated his medical school acceptance. He starts in the fall." Darius smiled warmly. "That's wonderful news. How's he adjusting to freedom?" "Better each day," Linda replied. "The wrongful conviction support group helps, and working at the tech lab gives him purpose, especially knowing he's helping prevent what happened to him from happening to others." Marcus Park had been released 3 months earlier after a judge vacated his conviction, citing fundamental flaws in the algorithmic evidence. He wasn't alone. 73 other individuals identified by the same flawed system had since had their cases reopened, with 41 convictions already overturned. But Marcus had gone beyond seeking personal justice. Working with Coltech's Algorithmic Justice Lab, he was helping develop new standards for facial recognition in law enforcement, standards that required human review, transparent methodology, and regular bias audits. As their conversation continued, a stir near the entrance drew their attention. Edward Kincaid had arrived, looking notably different from the arrogant figure who had demanded special treatment 6 months earlier. The designer suits remained, but the entitled bearing had been replaced by something more measured, more thoughtful. "I still can't believe you hired him," Janet murmured to Darius. "I didn't hire him," Darius corrected. "I challenged him. There's a difference." After weeks of consideration following their hospital room conversation, Edward had reached out to Darius with an unexpected proposal. He wanted to lead a complete overhaul of Meridian Global's algorithmic ethics practices, not as part of Coltech, but as an independent reformation from within the very company that had perpetuated the problems. Initially met with skepticism from all sides, Edward had gradually earned a measure of cautious respect by publicly acknowledging his company's failures, cooperating fully with federal investigators, and redirecting Meridian's considerable resources toward developing new frameworks for algorithmic fairness. Now, as he approached their group, the tension was palpable, but not hostile. "Cole," he greeted Darius with a nod. "Quite the turnout." "Edward," Darius returned evenly. "How's the ethics retrofit proceeding?" A hint of the old arrogance flickered across Edward's face, but it was tempered now by hard-earned humility. "Slower than I'd like. Challenging when you're dismantling biases you didn't realize you had." He glanced at Linda. "But necessary." Linda regarded him coolly. "I received your company's formal apology letter regarding my brother's case. The financial settlement helps with his restart, but the acknowledgement of wrongdoing meant more to him." Edward nodded, discomfort evident in his stance. "Was this always your plan?" he asked Darius quietly, echoing his question from the hospital room months earlier. "To force this level of industry-wide change?" "The plan was to expose what needed exposing," Darius replied honestly. "The response has exceeded even my expectations." And indeed it had. The airline's internal reforms had become a blueprint adopted by competitors eager to avoid similar crises. New legislation requiring algorithmic impact assessments for consumer-facing technologies was advancing through Congress with bipartisan support. A coalition of tech companies had established shared standards for identifying and mitigating bias in automated decision systems. Most significantly, public consciousness had shifted. What once might have been dismissed as an isolated incident was now recognized as part of a pattern requiring systemic solutions. The language of algorithmic bias had entered mainstream discourse, empowering more people to recognize and challenge discrimination in its modern, often invisible forms. As the formal program began, the museum director welcomed attendees before introducing the evening's keynote speaker. Darius took his place at the podium, surveying the gathered faces, some formerly adversaries, now reluctant allies in a shared cause. 6 months ago, he began, a flight attendant told me to move from my assigned seat because, in her words, we don't want any problems. What she didn't realize was that the real problem wasn't a passenger in the wrong seat. It was a system that predetermined who belonged where, based on appearance, rather than humanity. He paused, letting the words settle over the audience. That flight became a microcosm of larger societal patterns we've spent the past 6 months acknowledging, analyzing, and beginning to address. But our work is just beginning. True inclusivity isn't achieved through a single corrective action or policy change. It requires constant vigilance, honest self-examination, and a willingness to redesign systems built on flawed foundations. As Darius continued his address, Linda found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey from that fateful flight to this moment of industry transformation. She remembered her fear when confronting Marla, her uncertainty when approaching Darius, her disbelief when receiving the job offer that had changed her life's trajectory. Most of all, she remembered the moment she'd stood before a room full of airline executives and recounted her brother's story, how a flawed algorithm had stolen years of his life, and how the same biased systems shaped countless invisible decisions every day. The silence that had followed her testimony, the uncomfortable recognition in their eyes, had confirmed what Darius had told her from the beginning. Data alone rarely changed hearts. Stories did. Now, as Director of Ethics and Accountability at Coltech, Linda led a team dedicated to identifying algorithmic bias across industries and developing frameworks to counteract it. Her perspective as both insider and outsider, someone who had witnessed discrimination from within corporate structures but also experienced its impacts personally, made her uniquely effective at bridging technical solutions with human understanding. After Darius concluded his remarks to enthusiastic applause, the formal portion of the evening gave way to networking and continued conversations. Amid the buzz of discussion, a young black boy approached Darius with a school notebook in hand. "Mr. Cole, I'm doing a project about you for my technology ethics class. Could I ask you a question?" Darius smiled, crouching slightly to meet the boy at eye level. "Of course. What would you like to know?" "Was it scary?" the boy asked earnestly. "Standing up to all those people on the plane?" Darius considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "It wasn't scary because I was prepared," he answered carefully. "But it was sad to confirm what our data had already shown us, that, too often, people are judged not by who they are but by who others assume them to be." "Is that why you made your company?" the boy pressed. "To fix those problems?" "That's exactly why," Darius confirmed. "Because technology should serve humanity equally, not just those who already have advantages." As the boy thanked him and returned to his parents, Darius was struck by the simplicity of the exchange. How clearly this child understood what many adults struggled to acknowledge: that systems could be designed to perpetuate inequality or to promote justice, and that the choice between those outcomes was ultimately human, not algorithmic. Later that evening, as the event wound down, Darius found a moment of solitude on the museum's observation deck. The city stretched before him, a tapestry of lights, representing millions of lives shaped by systems both visible and invisible. Somewhere in that landscape, a young black boy was boarding a plane with his family, confidently taking his assigned business class seat with the simple expectation of being treated with the same respect as any other passenger. "Can I get you anything, sir?" a flight attendant would ask with genuine courtesy, seeing not a category, but an individual. Progress had begun. Not perfect, not complete, but underway. The slow, essential work of aligning systems with the values they claim to uphold. Darius's phone vibrated with a text from an unknown number. New problem brewing. Another test needed? Transportation was just the beginning. He smiled slightly, recognizing the syntax of his security team's encrypted communications. 6 months of progress represented meaningful change, but countless other industries remained, entrenched in the same patterns of algorithmic bias and systemic discrimination. His response was simple: book the ticket. The journey continued, not just his personal mission, but the collective movement toward systems that recognized and respected the full humanity of everyone they touched. From airline seating algorithms to healthcare delivery models, from lending decisions to educational opportunities, the work of creating truly equitable systems would require ongoing vigilance and courage. As Darius left the museum, he passed a school group gathered around an exhibit on the evolution of air travel. A young girl was asking her teacher why early passenger manifests separated travelers by race and why certain people weren't allowed in first-class sections. That was wrong, the teacher was explaining. People fought to change those rules, and when systems are wrong, it's our responsibility to fix them. Darius smiled to himself as he continued toward the exit. The lesson had taken root, not just in policy changes and corporate reforms, but in the next generation's understanding of their own power to question and transform the systems they inherited. That, more than any corporate pledge or legal settlement, represented the true legacy of his journey. The recognition that dignity wasn't a privilege to be granted based on appearance or status, but a right belonging equally to every passenger on humanity's shared flight. Would you recognize injustice if it happened right beside you, or would you too remain comfortably silent in your assigned seat? If this story moved you, hit like, subscribe, and share to help others see what often remains invisible at 30,000 feet and everywhere else.